Hello and welcome to Symbolic Studies. My name is Mario. Thanks for being here. I've got a good one for you today. Today we're going to be looking at every single lover's card in my personal tarot collection, which I believe we're going to be looking at around 30 cards. And what I like to do is put them in order and look at them from newest to oldest. So by the end of this presentation, we'll be looking at cards all the way from the 15th century. So to me, that's really interesting and cool just to see how far tarot has come along in the last 6 centuries. And I think that there's a lot to take away from these early cards too. There's subliminals in them that a lot of newer cards don't really include. The craftsmanship was different. People's attitudes and perspective on every single card has changed since then. So it's really an interesting sort of way of looking at this card and what it really represents and how people saw it be represented differently over time. And because some of these early decks were really high quality, I highly recommend you guys stick around until we get to the decks that are from the 17th, 16th, 15th century, because some of the details they include are honestly kind of mind-blowing. But before we check out any cards, just want to let you know that for exclusive content, you can visit symbolicstudies.com. You can also visit patreon.com/symbolicstudies to support the channel. So the first card we have today is the Somnia Tarot from 2021. So obviously that wasn't made too long ago. And shout out to its creator, Nicholas Bruno. He actually gifted me this deck, and I think he did an amazing job. So what he did was he actually recreated every single card using photography. And there's one specific detail in this card that I think is really, really profound. And I think that it's worth acknowledging. And that is that ladder in the background there, in between the couple. So one of the things we'll be talking about today is when you really decode the lover's card, you'll find that generally there are 3 figures. And it's kind of up for debate as well. What is happening with these 3 figures? Because when you look at older decks, it becomes more and more ambiguous. It becomes more vague, the role of every single figure. But what I found is that one figure in particular is kind of given the role of the central pillar. And we don't have a third figure here, but we have that ladder in the background, which to me, when I think of the central pillar, I think of a pillar of transcendence. And if you've been following my channel for a little while, you'll know that I've done quite a bit of work on this central pillar. And I very much relate Jacob's ladder or the stairway to heaven with this central pillar as well. And so this third figure representing the pillar, or this ladder, if you will, to the heavens, I think it's amazing that Nicholas decided to include a ladder here instead of actually having, say, a priest that you're going to see in a lot of other cards, or someone who's actually uniting the couple. So I think that's a very nice detail here that he included this ladder, because what it really represents as well is when a couple comes together, there is a third thing that's created, right? And you'll see this amongst a lot of Gemini symbolism as well, is that the twins actually create a third sort of quality. And that third quality has a transcendental aspect to it. It has a transcendental energy to it. And so for me, this ladder represents just that. By coming together with this reunification of opposites, if you will, now they can go on this new journey. Now there are new heights to reach. There are new realms to explore. So that's what I take away from this ladder. And if this middle pillar or middle axis dynamic doesn't quite resonate yet, it will by the end of the presentation, because I have some cards that really make this known and are very clear about it. And up next, we have the Golden Art Nouveau deck from 2019. And for those of you who study the tarot, you'll probably recognize that this looks very similar to the Rider-Waite deck. This whole deck essentially is an updated Rider-Waite clone, if you will. And there's this beautiful gold foil on every single card as well. I don't know if you can pick that up. But this is actually the deck that I use personally for my own readings and for clients as well. And so you generally see 2 figures, and you have the 2 trees in the background. Clearly, this is Eve on the left-hand side. And you can see the serpent wrapping around that tree. And then you have Adam on the right-hand side, and that tree is in flames. And then you have this central figure that is symbolically uniting the bride and groom here. And you also have what looks like a mountain peak in the background. And so to me, this central figure is symbolically being aligned with this mountain peak. And that mountain peak, to me, in my personal opinion, this is a world mountain. So this would be Mount Meru. This would be a polar northern mountain. So it would actually be a central mountain. What did I just say about the first card that we looked at today? There's usually a third figure that represents sort of a central pillar. The pillar is very, very similar to the mountain. Pyramids used to be referred to as pillars. That's my understanding. And so this figure in the middle symbolically represents sort of the middle way or the middle path, which that central pillar also aligns with. So in this card, that figure in the middle is that central pillar that balances these two other qualities, right? Masculine and feminine. So in many ways, it actually kind of reminds me of any scale, but even just imagine the scales of Libra, if you will. You have the two pans that are being weighed against each other. You might have black and white, masculine, feminine, whatever the qualities are that are being weighed against each other, whatever is actually in the pans. But then you actually have that central axis that allows the pans to be weighed against each other. That central figure represents that middle axis. And if you want to learn more about that, I actually did 2 presentations called The Axis of Libra, where I really get into this dynamic. So even if you imagine the Kabbalistic tree life, you have that central pillar that extends above and below the 2 side pillars. Those 2 side pillars, which basically, that's like the symbol for Gemini. And let's not forget, this card corresponds with Gemini. Those 2 pillars on the side represent lunar and solar energy, but the middle column represents polar energy. So this energy to me sort of predates and comes before these other 2 pillars. It kind of reminds me again of the Libra scales analogy in that you can't have these scales be weighed against each other without that central axis for them to pivot off of. So that is my quick 2 cents regarding the dynamic here between this man, this woman, and then this angel that's uniting the 2. And because it's an angel, it's presumed that they are older than this couple. They come from a more primordial era. They are more ancient, right? And so they come from the heavens. And also, I just have to say that a lot of people have said that this angel figure is actually not unlike Lucifer. So some people think that this is a Luciferian sort of figure here. But that, of course, is up for debate and up for your interpretation. And up next, we have Ethereal Visions from 2018. And this is a really simple, lovely deck. I'll say that it's a little light on esoteric symbolism. It's a little light on subliminal messaging and things like that. But what you see basically is just a couple embracing, right? And they have that Art Nouveau sort of style going on as well. You can't really tell here, but what looks like it's kind of black around the edges and down below with that line work is actually silver foil. So in real life, this card really pops. And in real life, this whole deck just looks really gorgeous. I'm really into the illustrative style, but you know, there's not too much to kind of decode, in my opinion, or really unpack. You have a young boy, you have a young girl. Obviously, we're talking about the lovers here, so that'll suffice, right? It's a nice card, but I don't know if I have too much to say about it beyond that. And here's our next card, the Pagan Otherworlds from 2016. And it's a fairly simple card, but one thing I do want to point out is that this third figure, this third pillar that I've been alluding to, I think is present with that tree. You even see the torch that Adam or the groom is holding. It's right next to that tree. So it's actually emphasizing, in my opinion, sort of the phallic nature of the tree. The tree extends all the way above and to the bottom of the canvas. And so tree symbolism and phallic symbolism, world axis symbolism, the implication is that it stretches and bridges the gap between heaven and earth, essentially. That's what the world tree represents. And so, once again, this third pillar that unites the couple sometimes is thought of as being older and wiser. And I think that is true here with that tree. You have that serpent down below that's wrapping around the tree, which makes this even more so the case, in my opinion. And so clearly they're creating an Adam and Eve situation here, and that would be the central tree. This would be the world tree. It's a very, very nice deck, but I don't know if I have too much more to say beyond that here. I will say I do think it's interesting that the woman here is holding an apple. This is an obvious reference to the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And in a way, woman herself has been viewed as forbidden fruit or an offering of some kind. So perhaps that's what's being alluded to here, but you will see this dynamic in other cards as well with the woman holding a fruit. Up next, we have Tarot of the Holy Light from 2015. And this is a really fun deck. If you've never seen it before, this creator decided to use a lot of really interesting, powerful alchemical illustrations and remix them for her deck. And so what you see here is really a story between man and woman, or a king and a queen. Clearly, the man has the head of a sun, the woman has the head of the moon. And not only is there a scene taking place sort of in public on the left-hand side, but there's also a scene happening in the lower right that looks to be a little more private. It's really interesting because it's almost like their energetic quality has sort of been flipped on its head. It almost looks like we're getting more of an exoteric scene outside and then a more esoteric scene within the cave. Up top, the sun looks happy, the moon looks happy. Down below, the sun looks a little aggressive, right? And actually, the moon, she looks a little frightened. And so it's showing different qualities of the sun and moon. To me, I see it as, one person in public, what they do in public, what they do, when they're out and about, their sort of front-facing persona, and then what happens behind closed doors, what happens within the symbolic cave, what happens, underneath the veil, if you will. And so I think that's kind of an interesting sort of idea. Also, the fact that they are in water within the cave is very interesting, because this reminds me of this old alchemical idea of the queen and the king uniting in a ritual bath, and that the ritual bath sort of symbolically is almost reminiscent of coming together, not unlike how a grail unites, right? So grail symbolism, chalice symbolism, it brings things together. That's what the cup represents. That's what our hearts tend to do. It brings things together. It sees similarities. It embraces. And I bring all of this up because clearly cups relate to water symbolism and emotional symbolism as well. And so I see a lot of overlapping themes between the cup, the bath, the pool, the ocean, etc. Let's proceed. This is in contrast to, say, the sword, which divides and which separates, which actually sword symbolism is on display in this card, especially in some specific cards, which we'll be getting into, because the sword divides. So it takes the one, splits it in half, and now you have two. And so it'll take the one, split it into two. So now you have black and white, or say man and woman, as an example. And I just have to say, now that I'm even thinking about it, this tarot deck doesn't actually correspond Gemini with the Lovers, but it actually corresponds Taurus with the Lovers. So that's an interesting sort of take as well. But this idea of a ritual bath between the king and the queen, that's something you can look into if you're interested. To sort of emphasize the point of one scene being public and the other one being private, notice the buildings on the right-hand side, right? And so very much so, the scene on the left is intended to imply this public sort of persona, whereas obviously what's happening in the scene is more private in nature. And really, that's kind of fascinating too, because this is the case with all couples as well, right? And so what you do in public, what you say in public, the types of experiences you have in public are different than the experiences that you have in private, of what you might say in private, of the types of conversations you might have in private. And that relates to Gemini as well. Communication, right? How you communicate, when you're out in the open, when you're out with friends versus when you're at home behind closed doors. So there's a lot to consider here. I think this is a very, very interesting card. And of course, as I kind of mentioned, a very interesting deck as well. Up next, we have the Night Sun Tarot from 2014. And this is one of the cards that really emphasizes the trio here. And so you have one figure that looks like the groom. He looks very much like Christ as well. In regards to this figure looking like Christ, also take note that he is wearing a crown of thorns, as is the woman on the right-hand side, and then he has the ram skulls on his shoulders. So Christ was crucified during Aries season, and he was referred to as the Lamb of God. The last thing I'll say here is that perhaps this woman is actually the bride of Christ, Mary Magdalene, and also there's a huge history with the Christian church actually frowning upon marriage. And so this was the case for a good long while. So that makes this scene that much more interesting. But let's proceed. And then you have what looks like the bride. And then you have what appears to be what unites the two, what actually brings the two together. And I like what they did here because they're actually following tradition with their hands. Believe it or not, pay attention to the hands with the lovers because it is very, very interesting, especially in these older decks. A lot of times you don't know why people are touching each other. It's kind of confusing. It's very, very ambiguous. And I believe it's actually designed to be that way. I used to say that this card has a lot of handsy people on it. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating is when you have this trio, I do think more often than not, you have one person representing that central pillar, but with their sort of posture and where their hands are placed, and even with their facial expression, you don't know if what's happening is positive or negative. In fact, a lot of the times what you pick up is something of a lover's quarrel, right? That there's some sort of issue between these three people. You don't know who's happy to be sort of engaged or coupled with the other person. You don't know who's jealous, right? And so I always think of the lover's quarrel when I think of some of these earlier cards. And so you don't know exactly why she is touching these two men the way she is. You don't know why the groom on the left is holding his hand out like that. You don't know why he has a clenched fist, right, with his right hand. And so this is something that you're going to see time and time and time again. We're going to see a number of cards that are kind of like this, right? And so now you can see that there's actually room for interpretation. And that I think is, again, by design. There is room for interpretation. You don't know actually what's happening. I think when you first kind of take a glance at it, you just think it's a simple sort of marriage, right? Bride-groom and then the officiator. But I don't think that that's always the case. There's something underneath. There's something that's veiled that actually wants to come out. There's a history here behind this couple. And so notice that the figure in the middle here, he's holding a lock and key. That is awesome. I love that symbolism. He's holding the lock next to the woman and he's holding the key next to the man. I think that is absolutely fantastic because symbolically, woman relates to the lock, man relates to the key. Poles and holes, right? The phallus and the yoni. And so to me, symbolically, that makes all the sense in the world. But there you go. The Night Sun Tarot. Very, very interesting. Up next, we have Tarot of the Third Millennium. This is from the year 2000. And this deck has blown me away so many times. In fact, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it is just a major arcana only deck. And the illustrator is so talented. Some of the things he put in here are really, really incredible. And so what you have here is a figure. He's looking away from the viewer. This is a very different take on the Lover's card. But when I saw this the other day and I really sat with it, my mouth was open. So I'm going to see if I can convey some of what I understood and what really made my jaw drop when I was decoding it the other night. So you have one figure facing away from the audience, right? You have a Cupid up top. you don't have this lover's quarrel. You don't have this dynamic between three people. There are two main figures here. You have the man looking away from us, and you have that Cupid. What I think is amazing is the gaze between Cupid and the man. This is the lovers. And how I personally see this symbolically is that this is the relationship between man and spirit. But I think that that's what's being implied here, that the lovers are actually present. They just look very, very different. And I just have to say, does this not look like it's supposed to be Muhammad? It looks like this is supposed to be the prophet, right? And you're not seeing his face, which is in line with that, I would say. Also, notice that the figure here who's looking away from us, his legs are spread. And so in some ways, I almost kind of see these legs as being symbolic of the two pillars, right? So once again, Gemini being those two pillars. It's not uncommon, again, to see two trees, in the lover's card or a couple. And so to me, his legs being spread kind of remind me of that a little bit, but they unite, right, with the man himself. And to me, one of the details that I think is just beautiful is the fact that he has his index finger out with his right hand. He's showing a number 1. And so this card really is all about the central pillar. Even though it relates to Gemini, which is the two pillars, the twin towers, you cannot understand the symbolism of the twin towers truly unless you understand the symbolism of the single tower, the single pillar. So if you want to understand the symbolism of the two, you have to understand the symbolism of the one. And he's showing you right there with his right hand, number 1. Because the implication is as well, is that the lovers, when they come together, this is actually a reunification. And so it's the one having been split in half into two that is now reuniting with each other. And so this is a really important sort of concept, is that anything that comes together in this reality, it's actually a reunification on a much, much grander, older scale. And something that needs to be understood about all of this is that Mercury rules Gemini and certainly relates to a lot of dualistic symbolism, but he also relates to the one. Let's not forget that the Magician card, which strongly relates to Mercury, is the first card in the major arcana. And so he relates to the pillar, he relates to the post, he relates to oneness. And so in many ways, he relates to that individual pillar that allows the system of the twin pillars to even exist to begin with. So I think that when you're talking about the Lover's card, it's really easy to be caught up in the dualistic aspect of the two different qualities, right? Obviously uniting, but it's actually the single pillar. It's also the one that's actually being emphasized in this card because it's the two becoming one. And what is the Hebrew letter that corresponds with this card? It's Zain or Zain, which means sword. The sword is a unified symbol. The sword also classically has been associated with the world axis and in many, many different ways implies or alludes to oneness. And this is a classic dynamic within the tarot to show you the opposing or polar opposite symbolism that the card actually represents. You will see this happen time and time again. Up next, we have the Jodorowsky deck from 1998. This is Alejandro Jodorowsky, the filmmaker. And what he essentially did was he took his favorite version of the Marseille deck and he really cleaned it up. And then he added his own little details all over the place. And so there are little symbols that you'll see that you don't really see in a lot of other versions of the Marseille, but he saw symbolism within it that he thought was really important. And so essentially we're talking about a Marseille deck, right? And this is one of those decks where the couple is very handsy. In fact, sometimes you don't know whose hand you're actually referring to. And again, what's really happening here? And so when you just really look at all of the hands here, you have to ask yourself, what is happening? Is there a sort of, again, lover's quarrel going on here? Are these positive sort of placements of the hand? Are these negative placements of the hands? Is there approval or disapproval going on here? I think that it's truly up for debates. I think that is partly what this card actually is about. And Gemini symbolism, there's a lot of back and forth symbolism when it comes to Gemini and the twins. It's been said that, people who are Geminis themselves, they might go back and forth with making a decision, seeing all of these different sides, and this can actually prevent them from making a decision, right? It's kind of like paralysis through analysis. And so it's kind of unclear by design why they are touching each other the way they are. Perhaps you have your own interpretation here, and I think that's what it's designed to do, is allow you to come up with sort of your own perspective on what's happening. But again, I think what a lot of times is happening is that there is one figure that is considered the central figure. And to me, it's that middle figure right there. To me, it looks like Cupid is aiming its arrow at that central figure. And notice that it's the two other figures that are looking at that middle figure, basically. And so to me, it's that central figure that is actually uniting all of these parties together. That if there's one person that's the unifying aspect, it would be that guy right there in the middle. Also, he's along the central line in this card, acknowledging where these figures are and what is happening visually in the central line of some of these older cards gives you a lot of important information. So as an example, in that central line, you have the 6 for the number of the card. You have Cupid, you have that sort of starburst behind Cupid, you have the central figure, you have the arrow, which is basically aiming at him as well. And so that central line in the middle, to me, it would make sense that he basically lines up with being that middle pillar. Hey guys, before we continue with the presentation, I'd like to talk about my new series called Symbolic Secrets. I just released the second episode on the Magician card, where I cover aspects of its symbolism rarely known or understood. I'm really excited with how this one came out. My next episode will be on the High Priestess card, and from there I'll be covering the rest of the major arcana. New episodes come out every other week. If you want to learn about the symbolic secrets of the tarot, sign up and let's take this ride together. At the moment, there are 2 ways to watch this series. Both options are by subscription for $5 a month. You can join through my Patreon, or you can subscribe through my website. This is also the perfect way to support the channel if you find value in my work. And with all that said, I hope you're enjoying the presentation. Let's get back to the lovers. Up next, we have Tarot of Ceremonial Magic from 1995. This is Lon Milo Duquette's deck, and he decided to do an Egyptian theme for the lovers. And what you see here, it looks like a pharaoh holding a flail and a crook, and then you have 2 women to the side of him, potentially Isis. I have not done a decode on the headdresses here, but to me it looks like 2 different expressions of Isis. But it looks like one headband is red, the other one is blue. Their headdresses are a bit different. Even the sort of band that wraps around their chest there, one is blue, one is red. So there is this sort of dualistic contrasting energetic quality happening here. Up above that middle figure, you have the scarab beetle with the wings. And again, I think that what you're following here is kind of the tradition with 3 figures, but one figure embodying the central pillar or the central axis. And it would clearly be that middle figure in white there. And by the way, the crook and the flail, just really quick, this has to do with shepherd symbolism. And so the flail is essentially a weapon, and you can use that to lead your flock to, wherever you want them to go. The crook is used as compassion. And so are you going to gently nudge them in the right direction, essentially? And so the pharaoh, by holding the crook and the flail, they are really unifying these 2 ideas, right? So they are acting again as that sort of central axis, and they weigh their options on which one is necessary, which one ought to be used. And kind of just like being a parent, sometimes you have to be compassionate and you have to be gentle and you have to be kind. Sometimes you might have to dole out some lessons. You might have to actually be a disciplinarian. And so I think that the crook and the flail has a lot to do with that. And obviously it's really, it's your decision and it's your discernment on when to use which. And here we have another Egyptian themed card. This is Tarot of the Ages from 1988. And the twin pillars are on display. And so again, there is an implied central pillar. He is that central pillar. And so he is the object of desire here, clearly, with these two women. They're both leaning up against him. They both want his favor. You have this sort of Cupid-like figure up in the heavens. The arrow isn't pointed towards him, but it's being pointed to the woman on the right-hand side. But all of the symbolism, right, that I'm kind of talking about with that central pillar, this implied middle pillar, this implied middle way, is really, really on display here. So this is, it's just an interesting card in that regard. And I'm sure there's other things going on here with the hieroglyphs on the pillars themselves and down below, which I have not personally decoded, but I think there's a lot to appreciate here regardless. And here we have the Barbara Walker deck from 1986, and a lot of the core symbolism is intact here. And once again, what I'm saying about this central pillar, it's really coming to light now. And so you have literally the two pillars on the sides that, are connected with that arch in the middle. And then you have the two women on the sides, and then you have that man right there in the middle. He is the middle pillar. He is the middle path. And look, he's holding that sword there. Again, Gemini corresponds, the Lover's card corresponds with the sword. And that sword, that sheath actually looks very phallic, and he's holding it right next to his crotch as well. This is not a mistake. This is not an accident. The phallus is actually being emphasized here. So isn't it interesting that this man represents the central pillar, the unifying pillar, and he is holding that sword next to his crotch, and he has obviously a penis. The penis is a magic wand. The penis is symbolically related to the pillar itself. And so to me, I see these two women as wanting his attention or wanting his approval in some way, shape, or form. And again, the handsy dynamic going on here is kind of interesting. And so I just wonder why the woman on the left is touching the shoulder of this man. He looks a little uncomfortable. And then you actually see the woman on the right, and she has one finger out with her left hand. So it's like, what's happening there? But otherwise, everything is pretty standard. But I think that this central column dynamic, just to emphasize it one more time, really, really is such a huge key here with this card. Here we have the Morgan Greer deck from 1979. And this deck is pretty classic. I love this deck for so many different reasons, but there isn't a whole lot to be said on the esoteric value or the subliminal symbolism. One of the things I will say, though, is that it's clearly very deliberate here that these are lilies. Lily symbolism is very interesting. The fleur-de-lis is often believed to be modeled after a lily. There's a lot of symbolism related to the lily and Virgo as well, which I've covered in other videos. There is a self-fertilization, parthenogenesis aspect related to the lily. It wasn't uncommon for myths involving a virgin birth, for the woman who has the virgin birth to be given a flower, sometimes a lily, before this actually occurs. So to me, there's just a fertility sort of aspect with the lily that I think perhaps is on display here. And it looks like they're going to make love. This is the lovers, so that would be appropriate. And so to me, this just kind of all lines up with that. But otherwise, not a whole lot to be said. I'm sure you guys maybe are picking up on other things, but I think we can kind of proceed to the next card here, which is the Hermetic Tarot from 1979. This is a classic deck. One of my favorite things about this deck is the fact that they actually include the alternative hermetic title for each card. So in this case, this would be Children of the Voice Divine. That is one of the alternative titles for the Lovers card, right? And that makes a lot of sense too. Gemini corresponds with air, and oftentimes people relate Gemini to the arms, but also the lungs. So Children of the Voice Divine, right? So your lungs, your ability to talk and project and communicate and things like that. So what we have here is a heroic scene of a maiden, chained maiden, being basically protected by this figure here, slaying this dragon or slaying this serpent. I'm thinking that this is probably Perseus and Andromeda, and there's symbolism galore about a princess or a young woman being chained, that she is really the object of desire. She's the object of pursuit. And so a young man freeing her from captivity, to me, makes a lot of sense for this card. And it may be referencing something very specific to mythologically. And if you have a better understanding of this card, please let me know. I didn't look into it before this presentation here. But obviously, this is a very, very different take. So one of the things I do like about this card is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the Hebrew letter that corresponds with this card means sword. And here you actually have a sword being used, no less, in the scene. And so the sword can be used for so many different things, but to save the princess, if you will, I think is a pretty cool touch. And for our next card, we have the El Gran Tarot Esoterico from 1978. I love this deck, guys. It is so charming. And the symbolism really is very, very powerful in some of the cards as well. So this is a Spanish deck. And really, a lot of the symbolism is just, it's intact here. And so I don't know if it really brings anything new per se to the table, but I love the aesthetic of it. But once again, you have a central figure. I think the man in the middle represents this central pillar. Clearly, this is what Cupid is pointing its arrow at. In this case, Cupid is also within an egg. Egg symbolism relates to Gemini. In some Gemini myths, they're said to be born from a cosmic egg. This relates to the myth of Leda and the swan, Leda making love to a swan and then giving birth to the Gemini twins via these eggs. And so I think that that's an interesting touch here. But once again, this lover's quarrel. Who is really the real partner of this figure here? Or is it a trio? What's really happening? Is everyone happy here with this circumstance? Or is someone kind of the third wheel, if you will? Also notice that the figure on the right, the woman on the right, is presenting an orange. So it appears to me in this example, the woman on the left has the true favor of the man in the middle, but the woman on the right is desiring it. And so she's doing what she can to basically get his attention. And what is he doing? He's looking right at us. He knows he's in this position, right? And so it's just an interesting sort of dynamic. Once again, what is happening between these three figures? It's also worth noting that in this deck, they're not associating the lovers with Gemini, but they're actually associating it once again with Taurus. So this is a common sort of correspondence that some creators have put onto this card. The last thing I'll say about this card, and I absolutely love this detail, I just noticed it, is the fact that they are standing where three paths or three roads meet. And certainly that's a great symbolic representation of what's going on here, each person representing a different path. So here we go. This is the Marty Jaeger from 1975. Sometimes this deck is affectionately called the Naked Jaeger because most of the figures are indeed naked. And you see a lot of similar symbolism here with this trio. So you have the man in the middle. Clearly, he's looking at the woman on the right. And it looks as though the woman is either looking at him or just above him. And then it's very, very interesting. This is very different from all the other decks, but you have this woman on the left-hand side, and she is kneeling and looking away. To me, I just pick up the vibe that the man in the middle and the woman on the left have a history together. And it appears as though he might be moving on. And so there's just a number of ways of interpreting what's happening here. But this is exactly in line with what I've been trying to say this whole entire time, where it's intentionally ambiguous. What do you guys see? I'd be very curious to know. All right, we got a couple of big classic decks coming up. This is the Thoth deck from 1943, and there's a lot going on here, right? You've got the two statues in the upper corners. You've got Cupid in the middle up top. You have this large figure that's uniting the couple. Something that people have said is that this is actually the Hermit from the Hermit card uniting the couple. I think that's very interesting to consider. And then you have the main couple themselves. Below them, you have two children, two babies, and then you have like animal totems right next to them as well. And so when I've been talking about this sort of oneness, this single pillar being on display and being an important aspect of this card, that is what Crowley decided to emphasize here. Because look how large and in charge that main figure is, right? That's uniting the couple. This is supposed to emphasize the oneness. Everything that's happening before him is happening within his silhouette. And so he is framing the couple. He is framing the children. He is framing those two animals as well. So he is actually the main figure here. It's not the couple. It's actually, that priest, that high priest that's unifying the two figures, who's cloaked, by the way, which I think is very, very interesting. So I think what he's saying here is really, truly, this card is not about the two. It's not about the couple. It's about the one. It's about what binds them together, what brings them together. It's about from which they came, which is the one, right? The two came from the one. The one was divided. There's different ways of looking at this. You can think of cell division if you want, but the one split from itself to create the two. And so really, the principle of unification has to do more so with the one, not the two necessarily coming together. You'll also see swords in the background, which makes sense given the Hebrew letter correspondence. But there's more to unpack. That Orphic egg down below is very interesting. There's so much to be said about this card. But let's proceed to the next one, which is the Rider-Waite or Waite-Smith deck from 1909. And we saw sort of a variation on this card with the Golden Art Nouveau. But for my money, I actually kind of prefer this better. I think the symbolism is more clear. And that to me, just visually, it just makes a lot more sense. And so you have the central figure, which I said potentially is Lucifer. They are being expressed from the heavens, from these clouds. They are just above a central mountain. This is Mount Meru, or the Polar Mountain. Notice that huge sun behind him. What I've said before is when you see a sun or sun-like luminary, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the actual physical sun that rises from the east and sets in the west. It can very well also indicate the central sun, the spiritual sun, the philosophical sun. And so I think that that's what's going on here. The fact that it is placed just above that mountain, that central polar mountain, it's actually referencing this central sun. It's not the sun that we see every single day. It's the stationary sun that symbolically everything revolves around. Further making my point that this figure in the middle corresponds with the central path. So you can literally imagine the woman on the left with the tree on the left being one pillar, the lunar pillar. You can imagine the man on the right being the solar pillar, and that central column is more stellar or polar or northern. There's a number of ways of referring to it, but there are actually three pillars here: a left, a right, and a middle pillar. The middle pillar, the middle path, there's so much symbolism that corresponds that with Mercury, which again, Mercury rules Gemini. And so, yeah, I think that that is pretty much most of what I really wanted to say here. And we've gone over, a handful of these symbols already. So let's proceed to the next one. This one is a really, really interesting to me. I don't know how much time I'll be spending on it, but this is the Soprafino deck from 1835. And a lot of the elements are present that I've been referring to here. You've got Cupid up top. You've got what looks like the unifying central figure there in the middle. And then you have the woman on the right, and then you have a king on the left. One thing I really want to emphasize here is I did a presentation on the Fool card a few weeks ago, and it's available for subscribers on Patreon and on my site. And one of the things I talked about was the Fool's relationship with jesters. And a lot of jesters and early clowns used to carry around a stick with them. And at the end of the stick, they actually had a little jester head on it, which looked exactly like them. So it was almost like this mini me sort of head on the end of this pole. I talked about the symbolism of that. I talked about how it relates to the Fool. I talked about how there's some Fool cards that actually have that figure holding something very similar or exactly like that. I talked about how this relates to the king. I talked about many, many different aspects related to this. And I'll be damned when I wasn't looking at this card that there is a subliminal going on here. Look at the king on the left. Do you see the crease that his sort of robe is creating? The straight crease? It's basically implying that he is one of those poles with the head at the end of it. So it creates a pole from the lower right foot of the central figure, and it shoots up, and then his gown or robe covers up the top of that symbolic pole, and then his head is just right there at the end of the pole. So do you see that? And then do you see that his right hand is almost touching it? It's almost like he's holding the pole that his head is attached to. And so I'm going to insert a photo of what I'm referring to here, and I think you guys will see exactly what I'm talking about. And so that to me blew my mind. I actually think I'm going to make a separate video about that because I just think it's brilliant on so many different levels. And then also to emphasize that this is actually what the creator was intending, notice that the central figure, his sword is actually stabbing that pole. It's stabbing that stick. And so sort of the symbolic implications here are many. And so I think that it is worth making a whole entire separate video about this because I just think it's so intriguing. Again, these early tarot makers, and this is only from 1835, so that is a while ago, don't get me wrong, but it's not that long ago. And so these early tarot makers, however, their awareness of symbolism and how subliminal messaging works was next level. And so I looked online to see if anyone else has picked up on it. I couldn't find anything, but I just thought I would point it out here because I think it's really fascinating. And here we have another deck from the 1800s. This is the one JJ Tarot from 1831. And this is a very sort of unique take on this trio here. One figure looks clearly much older than the younger couple. For the life of me personally, I can't tell if that's supposed to be a older man or an older woman on the left-hand side. I think it's perhaps left for interpretation. It's supposed to be ambiguous. And then you have the man in the middle pointing at them for whatever reason. And then it looks as though the young woman is looking down, perhaps in disapproval or disappointment in some way, shape, or form. So once again, this is up to interpretation. What do you guys think? I would love to know. The last thing I'll say is notice that the old figure on the left has a staff, which is basically a symbolic pole, which is rather synonymous with a column or a pillar. So I'm just no longer surprised anymore when I see one of the figures in the lovers be deliberately aligned with the pole or the pillar. Here we have the Neoclassico from 1810. This to me looks like a classic sort of version of the lovers' quarrel. It looks as though this woman is actually the central pillar in this instance here because she is the object of desire between these two men. And she's holding on to the hands of both of them. Isn't that interesting? And so again, my mind just kind of like spins on the history here. Who's happy? Who's not? Is there someone here that's being left out? Yeah, it to me looks like the figure on the left is a little bitter because it looks as though the woman in the middle actually truly wants to be with the guy on the right. And so I would be bitter as well. This is very interesting because I just brought up the whole entire jester dynamic, and there were old plays involving jesters where a jester would get his lover stolen from him and then he would be sad, basically, that there would be a charismatic jester that took his girl. And so it was kind of like this tragedy that sort of played out in this play. And so I think that that's kind of what we're seeing here. You know, everybody can kind of relate to this. Everybody can relate to wanting to be desired, having their eyes on somebody else, perhaps not wanting to be in the relationship that they're in, being jealous and things like that. So all of these things kind of come to play and come to light, in my opinion, right? Just this lovers sort of dynamic, what it feels like, you know, when you're in high school and in your early years and things like that, right? When there's someone that you liked and they didn't like you and they liked somebody else and all this stuff, right? To me, this card kind of symbolizes a lot of these different things. And here for our next card, we have a beautiful engraving, and this deck is generally referred to as Engraving Sec 18 from the 18th century. And this is actually showing you Leda and the Swan. So this is a very, very different take. And so my understanding, if I'm not mistaken, is that Zeus transformed himself into a swan so that he can make love to Leda, which he did like on a number of occasions. And so because of this dynamic, she actually gave birth to several eggs. And amongst them actually were the Gemini twins, Castor and Pollux. And so this is actually what you're seeing here, the lovers. So a woman with a swan. To me, this is interesting as well, because I mentioned briefly that egg symbolism really corresponds with Gemini symbolism in a number of ways. But then also the dynamic of all bird symbolism relating to air symbolism. And we're talking about a card that corresponds with the air because of Gemini, right? So to me, that makes a lot of sense as well. But yeah, so we have, you know, something from Greek mythology here on display. Very, very different take. You still have this large tree on the right-hand side, which is something, again, that we've seen multiple times now at this point. But besides that, I don't think I have too much more to say. And here we have the classic Marseille deck from 1709. And so I really love just aesthetically this version of the Marseille, you know, with showing the imperfections in the print and everything else. I just think it looks really cool and really interesting. But symbolically, I think we've pretty much explored most of what's really sort of happening here, right? One thing I'd like to point out before we move on is that I think it's interesting Gemini and Sagittarius are across from one another, because that means that there's a natural relationship between the twins and the archer. And now that I see this Cupid, its arrow and its bow are really coming out to me. And so it just makes me wonder if there is some sort of relationship with Sagittarius being the archer, the hunter, and then Cupid also being the symbolic hunter here. And this card naturally relates with Gemini, which is across the ecliptic from Sagittarius. So just thought I would point that out. I will say before we move on to actually the next Lovers card, I just want to mention that the Gemini twins actually appear in another card in the Marseille and in older decks, and that would actually be in the Sun card. So you oftentimes see two young boys, two children, or twins, twin brothers in front of a brick wall. So just something to kind of keep in mind, that Gemini and its symbolism, it appears throughout the tarot. But when I was looking through the Marseille and looking for the Lovers card, when I came across the Sun card, I thought it was perhaps just worth bringing up. In case you were unaware, this is the Gemini twins. And there's a whole history behind the Gemini twins and actually brick symbolism. The time of Gemini in ancient Babylon was actually referred to as the brick mold. And so I've gotten into that in other videos. But make no mistake about it, there's a huge correspondence with brick making, brick walls, the sun, and Gemini. And here we have another older deck for you. This is Tarot de Jacques Veville from 1650. And to me, it looks like altar boys in this instance. Doesn't this not look like all men, all boys? And so it looks like you have two altar boys on the right-hand side, and then it looks like you have an older male figure on the left-hand side. This deck is very abstract in a lot of ways. And so isn't that interesting, though? We see three male figures here. And it's kind of interesting because I wonder if these are actually brothers, if the two figures on the right are brothers. Perhaps the man on the left is the father, but what I've read multiple times, and I have yet to see like a really good example of this, is that my understanding is that early lovers cards were actually called the brothers and actually depicted Cain and Abel, which basically are like an overlay for Gemini symbolism. Cain obviously kills Abel. Romulus kills Remus. There's a number of hero twin myths where the bad twin kills the good twin. And so perhaps these are actually brothers, but my first take was altar boys. Maybe that's just my sort of projection here, but what do you guys see? I'd be curious to know for sure. So this is the Montaigne deck from the 15th century. The Montaigne is basically like a 50 card major arcana deck. And so there are some cards that are unrecognizable in the major arcana, and there's other cards that simply aren't present. But from what I look through, this appears to be the Lover's card because it is the 6th card. So it lines up with the number 6, and you have two figures. This lines up with that dynamic. As I said, it's my understanding that a lot of early decks didn't show lovers, but actually brothers. So that once again can be the case here. And they're both holding swords. So this lines up with the sword symbolism related to the card. One figure is in the foreground and appears to be much bigger, while the other figure is in the background and appears to be much smaller. And so that's kind of an interesting contrast between the two. With Gemini symbolism and with the twins, there's always this contrasting nature between the twins. And so notice that the figure up front, as an example, is wearing a cap. The figure in the back is not. The figure in the front has their sword up front. The figure on the left has their sword on the side. Everything is different. So what they're wearing is different. Their posture is different. Again, one is in the foreground, one is in the background. And so I see this as essentially being, the Lover's card or the Brother's card for this deck. Also, their hands are contrasting each other as well. The figure in the background, his hands are hidden. Meanwhile, the figure in the foreground, you can actually see his hands. So I think that's an interesting dynamic they're playing with as well. Here we have the Solabusca from the 15th century. And to me, there is no clear lovers or brothers correspondence. But I think if there was sort of a spiritual correspondence, this would be it. And this is actually the Ace of Swords. And what do you see? You see two figures, and there's contrasting symbolism between them. One is wearing a helmet, the other one isn't. One is blue, the other one isn't. The sword, that symbolic central pillar, is unifying the two. And one of the things that tripped me out about this one is notice the arm in the middle there up top, right? It's so confusing. Whose arm is that? It doesn't make any sense. It can't belong to the guy on the right because your body just simply doesn't work that way. And it can't belong to the guy on the left because your body just simply can't bend that way. And so this is an impossible arm. And this, it really opens up a whole can of worms because you'll see this over and over and over in the Solabusca. There are impossible illustrations. There's impossible postures. There's things that do not make sense, but they're intentional. It's by design. I'm convinced that it's by design. It's not because the artist didn't know how to represent somebody with their arm actually being attached to their shoulder. It's because there is another layer of symbolism going on here. And I can't help but think that it's sort of in line with everything that we're talking about. Subliminal symbolism, kind of being ambiguous, not knowing what's actually sort of going on. Subliminal symbolism kind of comes in under the radar. It comes in underneath your conscious mind. So there you go. So I felt like I had to include this one because there's too much overlapping symbolism to think that it's not sort of in line with the lovers or the brothers. Also, the figure on the right, there's that little feather plume coming from his helmet or cap, and feather symbolism is definitely in play here. And here we actually have our final card. This is the Visconti Forza from the 15th century. And my, that Cupid is taking up quite a bit of space. So it's almost as though the Cupid is maybe the main character here, which is something that we've seen a few times. The Cupid, or the figure that unites the couple, is actually kind of, the main, most prominent character in the canvas. So it looks as though the Cupid has two staffs or two spears, making them sort of the middle staff, middle spear, middle pillar, if you will. And you can barely see it, but actually you can tell that the Cupid is actually standing on a pedestal, which further indicates that he is this middle pillar. And while looking for a more clear version of this card, I came across this card here. And check out that artwork. That pole right in the middle is really speaking to everything I've been trying to say regarding this middle path, middle pole, middle axis dynamic. So I think that is really, really fascinating, and I felt like I had to include it. In the lower left, you have a young boy. In the lower right, you have a young woman. She's holding a green sphere. That's something that I think is kind of interesting that I've noticed throughout this presentation as well. How many times the woman or one of the figures has some sort of offering or some sort of object that they're holding. I think that's interesting. And this card, I don't think really is showing the true beauty of this deck, because that is actually gold foil. If we were to see an original of this card, that is gold foil in the background. Here it looks a little muddy. And then obviously this angel has these large wings that you can kind of see, and it really sort of frames and encapsulates the couple. And the couple there is, it's almost as though they're shaking hands, right? But again, I see sort of that central pillar dynamic in play here with this card. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Once again, for all things Symbolic Studies, you can visit symbolicstudies.com. If you're interested in supporting the channel or in some of my exclusive content, you can visit patreon.com/symbolicstudies. I do offer private readings and lessons if you're interested. If you want to learn the tarot, I've taught many people at this point. If you want a reading because you need some insights in your life, we can certainly do that as well. And I do have a new offering that I'm really excited about, and this is your Big Three exploration. And so for years, people have asked me, do you read natal charts? And for years, I've had to say, no, I don't. But I can tell you a lot about your chart and certain aspects of it, basically. But, there are people who have made a lifetime study of really decoding natal charts. And so I think I found a really kind of perfect compromise to lend my awareness of the signs and of astrology and get you to understand sort of a new layer of your chart. And this is through decoding your big three signs. So this would be your sun sign, moon sign, and rising sign. And really seeing what the symbolic imprint is between the three. And so what rising sign do you have, and how does this relate to your moon sign and sun sign? What is the relationship between these three signs, and what is the deep, deep symbolism between these three signs? And what can we basically uncover together about these? And so I think that this is a really exciting opportunity personally, because I know a lot about every single sign, and I love picking up patterns. I love picking up how these different signs relate to each other. And there's things going on between all of the signs, so what is sort of the main impression that these three signs give? And do you know about the symbolism behind these three signs? Do you really know about the esoteric symbolism behind your sun sign, behind your moon sign, behind your rising sign? And so to me, this is a good time. Personally, people are already signing up to do it. And I'd be more than happy, obviously, to get you scheduled and booked and talk to you about your big three. Guys, don't hesitate to text or send me a voicemail. You can do so at 503-893-4606. That is why I have this number out here and made available to you all, because people have simple questions about readings. People want to book a reading, but they don't want to go through the website. People have ordered prints through this number, things like that. So I am available. Get in touch. And I do have prints available. Right now I am promoting my Gemini print. And so these prints are silkscreen by hand. I illustrated this from scratch. They come with a bookmark. They come with an elemental study packet. They also come with a little breakdown sheet about the symbolism that you're seeing in the print itself. And so if you have a Gemini in your life, or you just like the artwork, or you want to support the channel, this is one great way to do so. And I have to mention the fact that I just released my second episode of the Symbolic Secrets series, this time on the Magician card. 2 weeks ago, I covered the Fool card, and I'm going to go through the whole entire Major Arcana. So if you've wanted to dive deep into the Major Arcana and you want to be on this journey, sign up at symbolicstudies.com or patreon.com/symbolicstudies. I also have the Elemental Study Packet available as a digital download for $5 on my site. And I have to mention the fact that I've been a graphic designer for a very long time now. So when I really think about it, it's been 25 years, 24 years, something along those lines. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, and I'm almost 40 years old now. And I've done everything under the sun, guys. Logos and billboards, and I've done magazine layouts, you name it, packaging, things like that. And so if you run a small business and you think there's something I can help out with, or if you're planning to start a small business and you think I can help out, please let me know. Personally, I would love to do more logos, and I would love to do more book covers. I love doing book covers. I love doing posters, things like that. So if I can be of assistance and you want a symbolically literate graphic designer, graphic design is what led me to symbolism. And so if you want to talk symbolism and you want to talk about your project and there's something you think I can assist with, please let me know. Last but not least, my fiance has a small business as well. It's called Michelle's Healing Home, and you can find all of her offerings at michelleshealinghome.com. I really encourage you to sign up for her newsletter because she drops new products once a month via her newsletter, her Full Moon Offerings newsletter, and she makes really fantastic, high quality, small batch remedies. So salves and tinctures, she makes soaps, she's done smoke blends, she's done teas, she's done so many different things. A lot of this stuff is literally grown in our garden, and it's organic or it's wild crafted. And so she also has a podcast called The Healing Home on YouTube. And so you guys should support her. When you support her, you support me. All right, guys, that's going to do it for me. Thank you once again for the support. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will talk to you soon.